Creation wasn't perfect, not according to the oldest written sources we have. Humanity was made, unmade, and rebuilt, with limits intentionally designed into the second version. The tablets that record this aren't mythology. They're documentation of what went wrong the first time. If the gods needed to try again, what happened to the first attempt? There's a clay tablet in the British Museum that most visitors walk past without stopping. 3rd floor, Ancient Mesopotamia Gallery, catalogue number K3773, excavated from the ruins of Nineveh in 1849. The placard labels it simply Creation Myth, Sumerian, circa 1800 BC. The description offers the standard academic framing religious beliefs of an ancient culture, symbolic explanations for human origins, the kind of language that keeps everything safely mythological. But the text itself doesn't read like mythology at all. It reads like a progress report. The tablet is part of a longer work called Enki and Ninmah, preserved across multiple fragments now scattered between London, Paris and Berlin, and it doesn't describe one act of creation. It describes 6 separate attempts to produce a functional human being. 6 prototypes, each one catalogued with disturbing precision. A human born unable to bend its arms, hands frozen, unable to grasp tools or perform the labour they were explicitly created for. A human born without sight, eyes that couldn't see, couldn't navigate the world independently. A human whose body couldn't retain fluids, incontinence so severe the text notes it as a defect requiring accommodation. A woman incapable of bearing children in a society where reproduction was considered essential to survival. A being without defined gender, neither male nor female, existing in a category the text treats not as variation, but as error. And finally, something the scribes called Umul, a creature that could not speak, could not eat properly, could not move, described in language that stops just short of horror, neither living nor dead. These aren't metaphors. The structure of the text doesn't support that reading. Each entry follows the same clinical format: creation attempt, observed defect, outcome. Some are repurposed for limited roles, others are simply noted and then the record moves on. What you're looking at isn't religious allegory, it's a development log. And here's what makes this remarkable. These texts don't stand alone. Across the broader Mesopotamian archive, the Atrahasis epic, the Aridogenesis, fragments scattered across dozens of tablets excavated from Nippur, Sippar and Babylon. The same pattern emerges. Creation, failure, adjustment, creation, failure, adjustment, and then, abruptly, the narrative shifts. A catastrophic flood, a divine decision to erase what had been made. And afterward, rising from the floodwaters, a second creation, a new humanity fashioned using different methods, subject to different limitations, carrying different constraints, encoded into their very biology. Shorter lifespans, infant mortality, infertility rates, susceptibility to disease. The post-flood texts don't hide this. They document it. These limitations, the tablets explain, weren't accidents. They were design choices, safeguards intentionally built into the second version to prevent whatever went wrong with the first. The question archaeologists don't ask in public, the question that hovers unspoken in museum catalogues and academic journals, is devastatingly simple. If the texts are describing something that actually happened, where did the first humans go? Why did these beings the tablets describe as shaping humanity from clay and divine blood? Why did they need to try again? What went so catastrophically wrong that total erasure and complete redesign became necessary? The answer doesn't live in a single text. It's scattered across clay archives, geological layers showing abrupt environmental collapse, flood strata discovered beneath ancient Mesopotamian cities, and the strange repetition of a narrative pattern, creation, catastrophe, reset, that appears not just in Sumer, but across cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries. The mythology remembers a flood. the archaeology confirms repeated destruction. And the texts, those ancient clay documents sitting in museum cases, describe humanity being rebuilt in the aftermath. Tonight, as the day fades and the world grows still, I'm going to take you back to those clay archives, to the cuneiform records that preserve what might be one of the most unsettling realizations in human history. That we are not a first draft, we are a revision. Close your eyes if it helps. The evidence I'm building doesn't need visuals, it needs attention. The kind of slow, careful focus that lets patterns emerge from fragments pressed into clay over 4,000 years ago. Before we go deeper, before we trace the tablets and the flood layers and the biological limits encoded into post-catastrophe humanity, if this resonates with you, a quiet like helps others find these stories. I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from tonight? What time is it there? Leave a comment if you'd like, a small mark of your presence in this moment we're sharing across time and distance. Now settle in. Let the sounds of the modern world fade into background hum, the way ancient sounds must have faded for Sumerian scribes as they pressed their reed styluses into wet clay, recording things they'd been told, things they'd witnessed, things they believed the future needed to remember. Because tonight, we're not just exploring ancient mythology, we're examining the records of what the gods tried to forget. The clay doesn't lie. It can crack, crumble, or spend millennia buried beneath sand and river silt, but the impressions remain. And when archaeologists began excavating the ruins of Nineveh in the mid-1800s, they discovered something that would quietly rewrite our understanding of how ancient people thought about creation itself. The clay doesn't lie. It can crack, crumble, or spend millennia buried beneath sand and river silt, but the impressions remain. And when archaeologists began excavating the ruins of Nineveh in the mid-1800s, they discovered something that would quietly rewrite our understanding of how ancient people thought about creation itself. Austin Henry Layard wasn't looking for mythology when he unearthed the library of Ashurbanipal in 1849. He was looking for palace foundations, royal inscriptions, a proof of biblical kings. What he found instead were tens of thousands of clay tablets, administrative records, grain tallies, tax receipts, legal contracts, and mixed among them, without ceremony or separation, texts describing the creation of humanity, not once, twice. The tablets didn't arrive labelled as sacred literature. They were filed alongside brewery inventories and water rights disputes. Cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script pressed into wet clay with reed styluses, wasn't designed for poetry. It was designed for accounting, for permanence, for recording what needed to be remembered exactly as it happened. By the 1870s, scholars like George Smith had begun translating these fragments. They expected myth, allegory, symbolism, the kind of religious storytelling that every ancient culture produced. What they found instead was structure, repetition, a clinical attention to process and outcome that read less like theology and more like documentation. The texts now sit in climate-controlled archives. The British Museum holds the largest collection, the Louvre, the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, fragments from Nippur, excavated in the 1890s, fragments from Sippar, unearthed decades later. Each discovery added layers to the same narrative. Humanity created by the Anunnaki, failed designs catalogued, a flood triggered, and a second attempt made under revised conditions. Early scholars dismissed these as mythological frameworks, necessary fictions primitive cultures used to explain suffering, mortality, imperfection. It kept the categories clean, religion over here, history over there, myth as metaphor never record. But the tablets themselves resist that framing. They sit behind glass now, brown and brittle, covered in wedge-shaped impressions so small you need magnification to read them clearly. And if you look closely, if you trace the repetition, the format, the absence of moral commentary, you begin to see something else entirely. These weren't stories told to children around fires. They were records kept by administrators who believed they were documenting something real. If these tablets were meant to record how the world worked, not how it should have worked, what exactly were they trying to explain? Humanity wasn't born from love. It was born from exhaustion. The Atrahasis epic, preserved across multiple tablets dating to 1700 BC, opens not with divine intention or cosmic purpose, but with labour. Endless as grinding labour. The Igigi, a class of lesser gods, digging canals, dredging riverbeds, hauling earth to build irrigation networks across Mesopotamia's floodplains. The text specifies duration, 40 years. 40 years of uninterrupted work maintaining the infrastructure that kept the world functioning. And then, in year 41, they stopped. Not gradually, not through negotiation. The Atrahasis describes it as rebellion. Tools thrown down, fires lit, a march toward the estates of the Anunnaki, the senior gods who administered the cosmos. The text uses language typically reserved for political uprisings. The Igigi weren't praying for relief, they were demanding it. What's remarkable isn't that gods could rebel, it's that the text treats this as an administrative crisis, not a moral one. There's no judgment, no divine fury, just a problem that needed solving. The Anunnaki convene, they deliberate, and their solution is clinical: create a workforce to replace the Igigi, beings capable of labour but incapable of rebellion. Beings that could be controlled, humans. Meanwhile, while later religious traditions imagined creation as an act of love, beings formed in divine image, granted paradise, blessed with purpose, the Mesopotamian text described something else entirely. Humans were engineered, shaped from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, a deity executed specifically to provide the biological material needed. The text is precise about this. One god dies, his blood becomes the template, clay becomes flesh, and the new beings are assigned immediately to the canals. This wasn't theology, it was economics. The Atrahasis even explains the logic. The Anunnaki needed order, the world required maintenance, rivers flooded, fields needed irrigation, cities demanded grain. Someone had to do the work, and the Igigi had proven unreliable. Humans were the solution. Biological tools designed to fulfill a specific function within a system that predated them. There's no mention of souls, no discussion of morality or destiny, just capacity, endurance, reproductive rate. The gods didn't create companions, they created infrastructure. If humans were created to solve a problem, what happened when the solution itself didn't work? The first attempt didn't work. Neither did the second, or the third. Enki and Ninmah, a text preserved across fragments from Nippur and Ur, describes creation not as a singular divine act, but as a process, methodical, repetitive, and strangely devoid of triumph. The structure itself is unusual. Most ancient myths build toward resolution. This one builds towards something else entirely. The pattern repeats 6 times. Each iteration follows the same format: create, observe, assign. The language mirrors administrative records, the same grammatical construction used in temple inventories and labour rosters. There's no poetry here, no metaphor, just procedure. First creation, a human born unable to bend its arms, hands locked. The text notes this as a functional limitation, not a moral flaw. The being is assigned a role at the king's table, observation without labour. The record moves forward. Second creation, a human born without sight, eyes present but non-functional. Again, the text catalogues this clinically. The being is assigned to a musical role stationed where vision isn't required. No judgment, just accommodation. Third creation, a human whose body cannot retain fluids. The language describes incontinence with the same precision used for irrigation measurements. The being is placed in a role requiring minimal physical strain. The pattern continues. Fourth creation, a woman incapable of bearing children. In a society where reproduction was considered foundational to survival, this should register as catastrophe. But the text treats it as data. She's assigned elsewhere. The system adapts. Or a fifth creation, a being without defined gender, neither male nor female. The Sumerian term used here appears in legal texts to describe ambiguity, not variation. The scribes are recording something outside their categories, something the framework cannot easily process. Still, a role is found. But then the pattern changes. The sixth creation is different. The text calls it umul, a word that appears nowhere else in the corpus with the same meaning. Scholars debate the translation, but the description is consistent across fragments. Unable to speak, unable to eat properly, unable to move with coordination. The language describing it lacks the calm precision of earlier entries. There's hesitation, uncertainty, and critically, no role is assigned. The text doesn't explain what happened to this being. It doesn't offer theological justification or moral commentary. The administrative format that governed every prior entry simply stops. The record acknowledges the creation, catalogues its limitations, and then falls silent. For the first time, the system designed to accommodate every outcome encounters something it cannot integrate. What happens when a system designed to adapt encounters something it cannot accommodate at all? The text doesn't tell you what happened next. That's the problem. In Greek mythology, when Prometheus creates humans from clay, the story resolves. Zeus intervenes. Punishment is assigned. The narrative arc completes. In Norse tradition, when the gods shape Ask and Embla from driftwood, life is given, purpose is declared, and the story moves forward into destiny. Hindu cosmology describes multiple creations and destructions, but each cycle is explained: cosmic necessity, divine play, the breath of Brahma. Mesopotamian texts don't work that way. Enki and Ninmah catalogue 6 creations. 5 are accommodated, roles are found. The system absorbs them, but the 6th, the umul, receives no assignment, no explanation, no theological justification for what went wrong or what should be done. The text simply moves on. Scholars who study ancient Near Eastern literature note this with careful language. They describe it as narrative incompletion or unresolved tension. What they rarely state plainly is how unusual this is. Ancient mythologies typically explain failure. They assign blame, offer moral lessons, or reframe disaster as necessary sacrifice. Mesopotamian scribes trained in precision, fluent in the administrative language that governed everything from temple offerings to water rites, chose not to do this. They recorded the creation. They described its limitations in the same clinical detail used for every prior attempt. And then they stopped writing. This absence isn't accidental corruption or a lost fragment. The pattern holds across multiple copies of the text excavated from different cities separated by centuries. The silence is consistent, intentional. It's the silence that tells you something went irreparably wrong. Other mythological traditions resolve their creation problems through divine intervention. The Greek gods erase the Bronze Age humans with floods, but they explain why. Hubris, moral failure, deviation from divine law. The Norse gods know Ragnarok is coming and prepare for renewal. Even in the Epic of Gilgamesh, when the gods send the flood, they provide reasoning. Humanity's noise disturbed their rest. But Enki and Ninmah doesn't offer that comfort. The 6th creation exists in the record as unresolved data. A being that couldn't be integrated. A problem the gods themselves couldn't solve through adaptation or accommodation. And the text, rather than inventing an explanation, preserves the uncertainty. This is what makes Mesopotamian creation literature so unsettling when you read it carefully. It doesn't mythologize failure into lesson or inevitability. It documents failure as failure, and then moves forward into a world where that failure remains unaddressed. If even the gods could not resolve the problem of creation, what choice remained? The flood wasn't punishment. It was population control. The Atrahasis epic is explicit about this in ways that make modern readers uncomfortable. 1200 years had passed since humanity's creation. The text specifies this: 1200 years of reproduction, expansion, agricultural development. And then the problem emerged. Not sin, not rebellion, not moral failure. Noise. The word used in the Akkadian text is rigmu, a term that appears in administrative documents to describe disturbance, disorder, unsustainable activity. Humanity had grown too numerous. Cities had expanded beyond their agricultural base. The text describes the gods lying awake, unable to rest, overwhelmed by the constant hum of human civilization pressing against the boundaries of the world's capacity to sustain it. But then the reasoning shifts. There isn't divine irritation, it's system overload. Ye the Anunnaki convene, not in wrath, but in deliberation. The text preserves their debate. Enlil, the chief administrator, proposes reduction, not eradication, reduction. He suggests plague first, then famine, then drought. Each measure is implemented, each fails to produce lasting effect. Humanity adapts, population recovers, the noise returns, and so the final option is raised: flood. What's striking is that this decision isn't unanimous. Enki, the god who originally shaped humanity, opposes it. Not on moral grounds, the text doesn't frame his objection that way, but on practical ones. Humans were created to solve a problem. Eliminating them entirely reintroduces the original crisis. The debate continues. Votes are cast. The flood is authorized. In the Genesis account written centuries later, Noah is saved because of righteousness. The text is explicit. He was morally worthy, but in Atrahasis, the survivor, Atrahasis himself, is saved because Enki warns him, not because he earned it, not because he was chosen for virtue. Enki simply couldn't bring himself to erase his own work completely. The flood comes. The text describes it with the precision of administrative annals. Duration, water sources, the mechanics of destruction. And when it ends, the world is reset. Population reduced. Cities erased. The first human civilization, whatever it had become over 1200 years, gone. Later traditions would reinterpret this as divine justice, moral consequence, the wages of sin. But the Mesopotamian version refuses that framing. The gods didn't flood the earth because humanity was wicked. They flooded it because humanity worked too well. The solution had exceeded its design parameters. If the flood ended the first human world, what kind of humanity could exist afterward? The second creation came with instructions, built-in limitations, constraints that didn't exist before. After the flood, when the gods fashioned new humans from the remnants of the old world, the Atrahasis describes a redesign, deliberate, specific, and permanent. These weren't curses. The text doesn't use that language. These were features, safeguards encoded into biology itself to prevent the same systemic failure that necessitated the flood. First, shortened lifespans. Pre-flood king lists preserved in texts like the Sumerian king list describe rulers reigning for thousands of years, figures so extreme that scholars dismiss them as symbolic. But the pattern is consistent. After the flood, the numbers drop dramatically. Lifespans measured in decades, not millennia. The text explains this as intentional reduction, a biological governor designed to prevent the accumulation of knowledge, power, and population density that characterized the first human world. Second, infant mortality. The Atrahasis is explicit. Some children would not survive, not as punishment, but as population regulation. The gods established categories of women who would never bear children, priestesses dedicated to temples, women whose bodies would not sustain pregnancy. This wasn't accidental variation. It was social engineering embedded into the structure of post-flood society. Third, disease. The text describes this without euphemism. Demons of illness would be permitted to move among humanity, not constantly, but regularly enough to thin populations when they grew too dense. Plague, fever, weakness, biological limiters that ancient Mesopotamians understood as divine design, not divine wrath. Fourth, reproductive controls. Specific roles were created for women who would not contribute to population growth. Temple servants, ritual specialists, the Naditu priestesses who were forbidden from bearing children by religious law. These weren't exceptions to the system. They were built into it. And here's what makes this remarkable. These limitations align precisely with the realities of early agrarian life in Mesopotamia. High infant mortality, endemic disease, shortened lifespans, social structures that regulated reproduction. Later traditions would interpret these as consequences of human sin, evidence of a fallen world. But the Mesopotamian texts describe them as deliberate design features implemented after a catastrophic failure of the first human model. The gods didn't abandon humanity to suffering. They built suffering into the architecture of survival. Archaeological evidence supports this narrative framework. Skeletal remains from early Mesopotamian settlements show high rates of childhood mortality, nutritional deficiency, and disease. Temple records document priestess classes with specific reproductive restrictions. Legal codes regulate family size and inheritance in ways that suggest population control wasn't just religious ideology, it was administrative policy. Why would ancient people remember limits so clearly unless they had lived through collapse? Mesopotamia didn't have floods. It was defined by them. The Tigris and Euphrates don't behave like other river systems. The Nile floods predictably, depositing fertile silt on schedule each year, a rhythm ancient Egyptians learned to anticipate and celebrate. But the twin rivers of Mesopotamia flood without warning. Spring snowmelt from the Zagros and Taurus mountains arrives irregularly, sometimes gently, sometimes catastrophically. The floodwaters carry not just silt but devastation. Entire cities erased, populations displaced, centuries of infrastructure reduced to mud. This isn't speculation, it's stratigraphy. When archaeologists excavated in the 1920s, Leonard Woolley discovered something that briefly made international headlines: a layer of clean, water-deposited clay over 8 feet thick separating two distinct occupation levels. Beneath it, pottery and architecture from one era. Above it, a completely different material culture. He called it evidence of the biblical flood. Later excavations would complicate that claim, but the flood layer itself remains undeniable. Similar layers appear at Kish, at Shuruppak, at Uruk, not all at the same depth, not all from the same period. Some date to 3900 BC, others to 2800 BC. The floods weren't singular events, they were recurring catastrophes, Changsha buried, populations forced to migrate, and then, decades or centuries later, new settlements built directly atop the ruins of the old. The archaeological record shows this pattern extending back millennia. Cities rise, floods come, cities are abandoned, and then, inevitably, they rise again. Same location, new foundations. Memory preserved not through continuous habitation, but through the deliberate choice to rebuild where destruction had occurred. This is where myth and geography converge. If you live in a landscape where civilization itself can be erased by water within a single generation, you don't treat floods as random misfortune. You encode them into origin stories. You preserve the memory of total collapse so future generations understand that survival depends not on permanence, but on the ability to rebuild. The Mesopotamian flood myths, Atrahasis, Eridu-Genesis. The flood account embedded in Gilgamesh aren't metaphors for moral judgment, they're cultural memory shaped into narrative. The warning isn't behave or be destroyed, it's this will happen again, be ready. Meanwhile, cities rose again. Rebuilt at least 4 times in documented history. Babylon was destroyed and resurrected repeatedly across 2 millennia. Nineveh, the great Assyrian capital excavated by Layard, sits atop occupation layers extending back over 7,000 years, each one separated by evidence of violent flooding or military destruction, each one followed by renewal. The texts describing humanity's recreation after the flood aren't describing a single mythical event. They're describing what every Mesopotamian city experienced multiple times, the end of everything familiar, and the necessity of starting over with the knowledge that it could all be erased again. Floods didn't just shape Mesopotamian theology, they shaped Mesopotamian consciousness, the understanding that civilization is temporary, that catastrophe is inevitable, and that human persistence depends on the willingness to rebuild after total loss. But here's the problem. The flood narrative appears far beyond Mesopotamia. Different languages, different geographies, different eras. The structure remains. Creation, population growth, divine decision, catastrophic flood, humanity renewed under new conditions. Greek tradition preserves it in the story of Deucalion. Hindu texts describe it in the tale of Manu. Indigenous American cultures recount nearly identical patterns. If flood and collapse shaped memory in Mesopotamia, why do similar stories appear far beyond it? The pattern doesn't belong to Mesopotamia alone. It repeats. Different languages, different continents, different millennia. But the structure remains intact. Humanity created, humanity fails or grows unmanageable. Catastrophe erases the first attempt, and a second creation emerges under revised conditions. This isn't cultural borrowing. The distances are too great. The timelines don't align for direct transmission. Yet the narrative architecture is nearly identical. In the Hebrew tradition, Genesis describes a single creation followed by the flood. But earlier Jewish commentary preserved in texts like the Book of Jubilees hints at pre-Adamic beings, humans or human-like creatures that existed before the recognized creation account. The flood in Genesis mirrors the Mesopotamian version so closely that scholars have long noted the parallels. A chosen survivor, a boat, animals preserved, divine regret, a world renewed. Different theology, same structure. The Greek tradition preserves it explicitly. Hesiod's works and days describes 5 ages of humanity: gold, silver, bronze, heroic, and iron. Each age ends in destruction. The Bronze Age humans, violent and powerful, are erased by Zeus through flood. Deucalion and Pyrrha survive, and from the stones they throw, a new humanity emerges. Creation, failure, flood, renewal. The framework holds. But then the pattern appears where it shouldn't, in cultures with no plausible contact with the ancient Near East. The Popol Vuh, the creation epic of the Kichi Maya, recorded in the 16th century but preserving far older oral traditions, describes not 1 but 3 failed attempts to create humanity. The first humans are made from mud. They dissolve. The second are carved from wood. They lack souls and are destroyed by a flood sent by the gods. The third creation, made from maize, finally succeeds. Different materials, different deities, same iterative process. Create, fail, destroy, try again. Hindu cosmology, preserved in texts like the Shatapatha Brahmana and the Matsya Purana, describes cyclical destructions through flood. Manu, the first man, is warned by a fish avatar of Vishnu. He builds a boat. The flood comes. Humanity is renewed from Manu's lineage. The narrative structure mirrors Mesopotamia so precisely that early comparative mythologists assume direct influence. But the texts predate any known contact, and the theological frameworks are entirely distinct. Different names, same structure. Indigenous traditions across the Americas preserve flood narratives: Hopi, Lakota, Chibcha, Mapuche. Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime stories describe great floods that reshape the land and force cultural renewal. Pacific Island mythologies from Hawaii to Polynesia recount similar destruction and rebirth patterns. These aren't vague water stories. They follow the specific sequence: human expansion or failure, divine response, catastrophic flood, and a new beginning under different terms. Anthropologists and comparative mythologists offer explanations. Joseph Campbell suggested universal archetypes, psychological patterns inherent to human cognition. Claude Lévi-Strauss argued these myths reflect structural thinking, the human mind organizing chaos into narrative. Others propose that all cultures experience floods, so all cultures create flood myths. But that explanation doesn't account for the specificity. Not just floods, but floods as resets. Not just destruction, but destruction followed by intentional redesign. Not just survival, but survival of a single family or lineage chosen to carry forward under revised conditions. The pattern isn't explained by geography alone. Mesopotamia's floods don't resemble Mesoamerican rainfall or Greek tsunamis or Indian monsoons. Yet the mythological response is structurally identical. This suggests something else: myth as survival technology. As when civilizations collapse, whether through environmental catastrophe, warfare, or systemic failure, the survivors need more than tools and food. They need a framework for understanding what happened and how to prevent recurrence. The two creations narrative provides that framework. It encodes the lesson: humanity can fail. Renewal is possible. But the second attempt must include safeguards against whatever destroyed the first. Myth becomes memory, becomes instruction. If ancient people across the world remembered renewal after collapse, what were they trying to preserve? The tablets are still there, behind glass, catalogue numbers unchanged, K3773 in the British Museum, the Atrahasis fragments in the Louvre, the Enki and Ninmah texts scattered across Berlin, Oxford and Philadelphia. There are thousands of clay impressions pressed by hands that have been dust for over 4,000 years, and what they preserve isn't inspiration, it's warning. The two creations narrative persisted not because it was beautiful, but because it was useful. It taught survival. It encoded the understanding that perfection was never the goal. Endurance was. That humanity's purpose wasn't to transcend limitation, but to function within it. That the second creation, the one built with constraints, was the one designed to last. Ancient scribes didn't write these texts to celebrate divine power. They wrote them to explain why life was hard, why children died, why floods came, why limits existed that couldn't be overcome through effort or prayer. The myths weren't escapes from reality. They were frameworks for accepting it. And here's what makes this remarkable. The framework worked. Mesopotamian civilization endured for over 3,000 years, longer than any empire that followed. Cities destroyed by flood were rebuilt. Dynasties collapsed and reformed. Populations were displaced and returned. The cycle repeated, and each time the cultural memory remained. This has happened before. This will happen again. And survival depends not on preventing catastrophe, but on preparing for renewal after it. History in this understanding isn't linear progress towards some ultimate destiny. It's cyclical, creation and collapse, order and chaos, building and rebuilding. The tablets don't promise transcendence. They promise continuity, if you're willing to accept the terms. Modern thought rejects this framework. We prefer narratives of advancement, improvement, as evolution towards something better. We see limits as problems to solve, not features to accommodate. We imagine ourselves as the culmination of history, rather than another iteration in a pattern that predates writing itself. But the tablets remain, and the pattern they describe, creation, failure, reset, redesign, continues to appear not just in ancient myth, but in the structure of civilizations that rise, overextend, collapse, and are eventually rebuilt by survivors who carry forward the memory of what went wrong. The question the Mesopotamians asked wasn't, can we be perfect? It was, can we endure? And they answered it not with hope or faith, but with documentation, with records preserved in the most durable medium available, pressed into clay that could survive fire, flood, and millennia of burial. They built their memory to last longer than their cities, because they understood something we've forgotten, that being remembered matters more than being right, that survival depends on passing forward not just tools and techniques, but the knowledge of failure, how it happens, why it happens, and what comes after. If history remembers humanity not as perfect, but as resilient, what responsibility does that leave us with now?